So what I will do in this talk is review the main approaches to conceptual format that have been proposed, and in particular recent proposals that combine the main modal and amodal formats, and argue that recent evidence coming from different experimental paradigms supports a broader version of a pluralist theory for conceptual format. So within the framework that takes concepts to be mental representations of categories, it is claimed that concepts have a content, they have semantic properties, are about something, and a specific format or vehicle that carries that semantic content. The main types of format that have been proposed in the literature are the modal type. The modal approach claims that concepts are couched in the same format of the representations used by the systems that support perception, action, and internal states. And they hold the neural reuse thesis, according to which when we encounter instances of categories, a set of representations gets activated in these systems, in the systems for perception, action, and internal states, and a particular subset of those representations can be later reactivated or reused in order to think of that category in absence of its instances. And the other main approach is the amodal one, according to which concepts are couched in a symbolic format that is different from the formats of each perceptual modality, and there is a process of transduction from perceptual and motor systems into a separate and different system, which with its proprietary format, which is amodal. A typical objection against modal representations is that they can't account for abstract concepts for which we do not have perceptual or motor specific representations. And a typical objection against amodal representations, which has become weaker lately, is that they can't represent by themselves in a standalone manner. But recently there has been proposed some studies showing evidence of amodal representations that can represent in a standalone manner. So there has been an increased amount of evidence for both modal and amodal representations. And this has led some researchers to propose hybrid and pluralist approaches, which are distinguished mainly for the role they ascribe to each type of format. So hybrid approaches claim that both modal and amodal representations need to be active in order to use a concept. And there are two main proposals within this hybrid framework. According to the first one, which is the hubs and spokes view, amodal representations are central, and modal representations play an auxiliary role and could be more or less activated depending on the concepts. And there is another proposal which attributes equal roles for both modal and amodal representations and claims that they sort of operate mutually restricting each other in their activation. Depending on the context, each type of representations could be more or less activated. And this proposal comes from discourse comprehension theories. And in contrast, pluralist approaches claim that both amodal and modal representations can intervene by themselves in conceptual tasks, so it could be activated without the other type of format being activated. But usually these theories propose a distinction by domains, attributing the amodal format to abstract concepts and the modal format to more concrete concepts. And what I will propose is that there is a relative amount of evidence for a broader version of pluralism, according to which a concept could have a modal or an amodal format as the same, a single concept. So it's not restricted to domains such as abstract concepts are amodal and concrete concepts are modal. So my plan is to focus on the evidence on how we represent a single concept, a single abstract concept, that of negation. And there seem to be alternative strategies for how we think of negation and how we represent the single concept. And this evidence goes against a distinction by domains, but doesn't support a hybrid position either. So I will argue that it supports a more general or broader pluralist approach, not restricted to specific domains, at least for the use of concepts. And I will introduce this distinction between the use or activation of a concept in order to perform a certain task from the long-term storage of concepts of categories. This will be the final part. And I will focus on evidence coming from 3 different experimental paradigms. One is a word typing study, the other one is an eye tracking study from the visual word paradigm, and finally a counterfactual reasoning study as well. So the word typing paradigm presents an interesting option because it presents participants with an everyday task, which is to type a word. And in typing, linguistic and motor process are coupled and could be studied together, how they interact. And it is assumed that action verbs, and then showed in the study, in particular manual action verbs, differentially interfere with motor programming and execution processes during typing. So Garcia Marco and his colleagues conducted a study evaluating this differential impact of negation, depending on the verb type, on 2 measurements. Motor programming, which is the lapse between target onset and first keystroke, and it's measured as first letter lag, and motor execution, which is the lapse between first and last keystroke, and the measurements were of whole word lag. And the task that they gave participants was to type the final word of the second sentence of a pair. I should have translated those inputs. This study was conducted in Spanish. So they presented participants with a pair of sentences, like in the first set, they used 3 types of verbs. One type was a manual action verb, and the sentences were, for example, there is a contract, now you will or will not sign it. And the task was to type the final verb, the final word, as soon as they read it. They had to read the sentences on a screen and then type the final word. So the first type of verb was a manual action verb, signing. The second type was, for example, there is the woman, now you will or will not talk to her. So talk, and non-manual action verb. Or, this is a peculiar example, there is a lie, now you will or will not believe it. And this is a non-action verb, believe. And what this study showed was that negation selectively affected manual action verbs. This was measured as a longer whole word lag relative to affirmative manual action verbs, negative non-manual action verbs, and non-action verbs. So the idea is that in this typing study, when you have to type a word, if negation is represented as a, let's go a step back. If manual action verbs are modally presented as motor routines and negation is the inhibition of that motor routines, it will interfere with the action of performing such a motor routine in typing. So the selective inhibitory effects of sentential negation on manual action verbs suggest that, which is just said, that a model representation of manual action verbs involving, that there is a modal representation of manual action verbs involving motor routines, and negation can be modally represented as the inhibition of such motor routines, which suggests that modal representations are constitutive in representing negation, at least in certain contexts. But other studies suggest that there are also model representations for the same concept of negation. In particular, this eye tracking study, which used the visual word paradigm, simultaneously presented verbal and visual stimuli while using an eye tracker to track the eye movements on the screen and the focus of the sight. And assuming that when linguistic input matches visual input, the eyes move towards the corresponding visual input. So this study contrasted the focus on a screen while processing negative propositions in binary versus multiple context. So participants were presented with 2 sentences on the screen. No, sorry, they heard the sentences. Like, the figure could be red or green. This is a binary context. Or the figure could be red or green or blue or yellow, which is a multiple alternatives context. And then they would see on the screen 4 figures with different colors and would hear another sentence, which could be either affirmative or negative, like the figure was red, the figure was not red. And they had no specific instruction to perform any task while looking at the screen. And then they received a question for a yes or no answer, like, were the figures triangles? They had to say yes or no. So the only task was to pay attention to what's going on. And what was predicted is that listening to the affirmative sentence, like the figure was red, the eyes will focus on the red figure. But with the negative one, what they found was an increase in fixation on the alternative color in binary context. If the figure could be red or green, and I'm told the figure is not red, I will focus my sight on the green figure. Whereas in multiple contexts, in which there are multiple alternatives and not a specific one to focus, the focus stays on the negated proposition, the negated color. And so this study first suggests that the way in which negated propositions are represented depends on the context, on whether there is an affirmative alternative to the negated proposition or not. When an affirmative is available, we may dispense of an explicit representation of the negation operator, which is consistent with the main modal views on how we represent negation, which is by simulating the alternative. But the fact that absent an alternative to the negated proposition, participants fixated on the mentioned color suggests that there is an alternative strategy, that they represent that color and combine it with an amodal symbol representing negation. So this study in itself would support a pluralist view for negation. And I'd like to present another one. So, well, that was the conclusion, that this suggests that amodal representations are constitutive in representing negation in certain context. But I would like to present another one which supports the same, but using a different experimental paradigm, which is a counterfactual reasoning study. And counterfactuals are interesting for studying negation because counterfactual conditionals immediately prompt thinking about the described counterfactual conjecture and also its opposites. So they immediately prompt us to think of negated propositions. For instance, if I say, if my flight had arrived on time, I would have spent more time in Santiago, you immediately know that my flight didn't arrive on time. So what Espino and Byrne did was conducting a study evaluating how we represent those presupposed facts and contrasting 2 alternative views on how we represent negation, which are related to the ones used in the previous study. According to one view, which is the alternates view, we represent an alternative to the negated proposition, which is consistent with modal simulations. So we represent an affirmative alternative proposition. And the annotated models view proposes that we construct mental models that can contain modal representations and propositional-like symbolic tags. So both modal and amodal representations. And in this study, participants had to draw a conclusion from a set of 3 premises which contained a counterfactual conditional, and could introduce either a binary or a multiple alternatives context. In the binary context, the premises were like this. For example, at the botanical gardens, the flowers were roses or poppies, and the trees were orange trees or apple trees. If the flowers had been roses, the trees would have been orange trees. There were no orange trees, therefore, and participants had to draw a conclusion, and the instructions were that the conclusion should follow necessarily from the premises, so they should construct a valid argument. And in the multiple context, the example was like that. At the botanical gardens, the flowers were roses or poppies or lilies, and the trees were orange trees or apple trees. There was always a binary context plus a context so that a conclusion can be drawn. If the flowers had been roses, the trees would have been orange trees. There were no orange trees, therefore, and they had to draw a conclusion. And the effect was a robust inference to alternates in a binary context. So, presented with the binary context argument, most participants draw an affirmative conclusion most of the time. It's always above 80%. So, most of them say there were poppies. And this effect is reduced for multiple contexts, in which some participants draw the negative conclusion. It is still the less amount, the less percentage. So most of them still draw the affirmative conclusion, but it appears these effects. So some of them draw the negative conclusion, there were no roses. And some, the affirmative conclusion, there were poppies or lilies. So this also suggests alternative representational strategies for negation depending on the context. And they also conducted further manipulations, so they conducted a large set of studies, and one of the manipulations they did was to make them solve several inferences with the same structure, either a binary or a multiple context. And after solving 8 inferences in binary context, the inference to alternates effect appears also in multiple contexts. So the affirmative conclusion gets higher in percentage for many inferences in binary contexts, whereas after solving 8 inferences in multiple contexts, the inference to alternates effects is reduced for binary contexts as well. So you can somehow train participants to use either one of the strategies. And this shows how the use of a strategy or another not only depends on the current stimulus, but can also be affected by previous experience, pointing out to a flexible system. So all of these studies offer some support for a pluralist approach, in the sense that there seem to be multiple strategies for representing negation, some consistent with modal approaches and others with amodal ones. And in contrast with the pluralist version that was restricted to domains, such as concrete versus abstract, a single concept can be represented in different formats using either a modal or an amodal representation. So this suggests that this offers support for a broader pluralist approach to conceptual format, not restricted to domains. And what I would like to add is that this evidence for a broader pluralist view corresponds to the use of concepts, to the idea that in order to solve a certain task, to use a concept in a specific context, there is an independent activation of the two types of formats. So we can use either modal or amodal representations of a single concept to solve a task. And in that sense, our conceptual system is pluralist and has a greater flexibility. But when we think of the long-term storage of concepts, if we do have alternative representations for a single concept in different formats, they need to be stored together, associated as representations of the same category. So if we think of the long-term storage of concepts, it would be better described as a hybrid, in which the representation of a category includes some modal representations and some amodal. And the reasons for this are not specific to considerations of format, but of content instead, in order to organize our conceptual system. So my argument would be, shortly, would be as follows. We do not want that alternative representations for the same category function as Frege cases, in which the agent doesn't know or uses as the representations of different categories. If we have alternative representations of negation, we will use them as representations of the same concept. And for them not to turn into a classic Frege case, they need to be associated somehow in long-term memory as representations of the same category. And this will also convey the system with certain stability. So these two features, we need to account for these two features, the flexibility of our conceptual system, but also the stability, in which categories do not change from one task to another. So to conclude, what I wanted to present is that there is evidence suggesting a plurality of representational strategies for the single abstract concept of negation, some consistent with the modal approach and some with the amodal one. And this supports a broad pluralist approach to conceptual format that does not restrict types of format to specific types of concepts, such as concrete versus abstract. And also that it is very important to distinguish the use and the long-term storage of concepts in order to account for its characteristics. And while modal and amodal representations can be independently activated during conceptual tasks, long-term storage of concepts is better accounted for by a hybrid approach. Incorporating a specific type of association could be, I don't know, sharing a same mental file when they are representations of the same category. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sabrina. Now we have some time for question and answer session.